Hiking is a very great way to get out and enjoy nature. However, there's a lot of different things that can happen on the trail and in the woods that even the most seasoned and most experienced hikers cannot prepare for. So join us today as we venture off into the Washington wilderness to find out what happened to four teenage friends that left them running for their lives and shaken to this very day. But before we get into today's encounter, if you've had an encounter or know a story that you would like to have shared here on the channel, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And if you haven't done so already, especially if you're a return viewer, please hit that subscribe button. While you're at it, take a rock and smash that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Now let's get into today's encounters. In 1999, there was a lot of concern, almost to the level of paranoia, about the year Y2K and what was going to happen on New Year's Day when computer system dates would roll back to 00. A lot of people thought when that happened that computers all over the world would just completely crash, banking systems would be wiped out, computers that controlled vital infrastructure systems such as utilities and power grids would shut completely down and those services would not be available. So it left a lot of people scrambling all through the year of 99, updating their systems to avoid this potential collapse. And while all the adults were in pure panic mode trying to get as much done in preparation for Y2K as possible, four teenagers living out in Eatonville, Washington State, could not be concerned at all about everything going on in the world. It was their summer vacation, and they were just looking to have a good time with each other. And that whole summer, two friends, Sam and David, along with their girlfriends, Sabrina and Katie, would spend pretty much every day together. They would spend the days down at the Marshall River south of town. They would go swimming, they would go fishing. In the evenings, they would typically find themselves back at one of their houses, either having a bonfire or just hanging out in the basement talking. Pretty much typical 16-year-old kid stuff. However, as summer progressed further along, they started to get bored doing the same thing every evening. So just like typical 16-year-old kids will do, they came up with an idea that they were going to tell each one of their parents that they would be staying at one of their houses, and that person would tell their parents they were going over to another kid's house, and then they would sneak out late at night, typically around 11 o'clock, midnight, once their parents were sleeping. They would hop on their bikes, they would ride east of town out to the foothills of the Rockies. From there, they would go park their bikes and they would walk various trails. They would typically, before they would leave, they would try to steal some of their parents' alcohol, steal some of their cigarettes, just so that they could go have a good time up in the woods together. They did these nighttime hikes for about a week, and they were becoming very confident at sneaking out, almost to the point of being overconfident. And they were finding that they were getting addicted to the adrenaline rush of doing these hikes. Not because they would be out of the bush at night, but because they knew that pretty much any time their parents can bust them and they would be in a lot of trouble. And because of their addiction that they were developing to that adrenaline rush of basically trying not to get caught, they decided that the next step would be to go off into the mountains overnight for an overnight camping trip. But in order to be able to successfully pull this off, they were going to have to come up with a plan. And the first step of their plan was to find somewhere where they would be able to go set up a camp where nobody would be able to find them. And that fell on to the boys. So one day, Sam and David, they hopped on their bikes, they rode east of town, they crossed the Marshall River, they made their way down this gravel road to a spot where there was a trail running off into the bush. That was a trail that they had been going down hiking for the past week at night. So they turned their bikes onto this trail. They only made it on their bikes about 100 yards. They pulled their bikes over to the side, laid them down in the trees, and then they carried on foot. They walked down this trail for about 45 minutes. Now, this trail, it's not very remote, but it is fairly rugged. The terrain's fairly steep. It goes up and down hill, very dense vegetation, very dense forests in this area. But these guys were fairly accustomed to going out into bush like this. They had basically been doing that their entire lives with their dads. Plus, for the last week, they've been wandering around this area at night. So they were completely fine and completely confident that if they stepped foot off that trail, that they would be able to find their way back onto it. So after about 45 minutes, they got up to this part. There was a bit of a ridge. They turned off the trail and they started bushwhacking into the bush. And they made it for about a half a mile. They came to a spot where there was a little bit of a ridge looking down into the small valley. And they figured, you know what, this would probably be the best place to set up camp. The girls would love this. They would have a clear view of the sky. They'd be able to see all the stars. This is where we're going to have to come. But then they decided that they were going to go just look around the area just to make sure that there was nothing in the area that could present a danger to them. So they made their way from that plateau down into that valley. As they made their way down into that valley, they noticed that the vegetation and the trees, they kind of thinned out a bit, and they could see that up ahead there was a clearing. So they started making their way towards this clearing when all of a sudden they both just completely stopped because something right in front of them had caught their attention. They both stood there for a second looking towards this one tree in front of them about 20 yards away, and they were trying to figure out what was different about this tree and why it drew their attention. So they very slowly started making their way towards a tree. And once they got up to it, they realized that what had caught their attention was the fact that on the trunk of this tree, there was this strange carving made right on the trunk. They stood there for a second looking at it. They felt the carving. And they both thought it was incredibly interesting. They ended up looking around and they noticed that a couple of other trees in the immediate area also had what appeared to be carvings on them as well. So they went to each one of these trees to check out these different carvings. Each one was very similar, but yet different at the same time. Both of them thought, you know what? This is a little bit creepy, but this is actually pretty cool. Like, I wonder what the purpose of these are, who left them, why. But you know what? The girls would love to see this. We have to bring the girls here tonight. So the two of them, they ended up making their way back up to that plateau, back across that ridge to the trail, back to their bikes. And then when they got home, they stopped by their girlfriends' places and they told them about these cool carvings that they had found out in the hills. And just as they expected, the girls thought it sounded incredibly interesting and they wanted to go check them out that night as well. So that night at around 11 o'clock, they met at David's place, and then from there, the four of them made their way out to that trail. Once they got to the trail, they dumped their bikes and then they set off on foot down the trail towards that ridge. Once they got to the ridge, they made their way half mile through the trees to that plateau. From the plateau, they made their way down into the valley. Once they got to the part in the valley where the trees and the vegetation started to spread out, they noticed about 500 yards away, directly in front of them, they could see these small lights moving through the trees on the other side of the clearing. The four of them instantly stopped and started staring towards these lights, trying to figure out what they were. And to them, from that distance, it looked like lanterns moving through the forest. The four of them were instantly filled with curiosity, and they kind of talked about it amongst themselves for a minute, and they decided that they just had to go check out these lights, find out what these lights were, and if it is people, who they are. So very slowly, they started making their way into the clearing. Now, this clearing was not just a big open field. There was various bushes and some trees scattered across it. So as they made their way into the clearing, they were trying to stay low, try to stay quiet, and they were moving from bush to bush, from tree to tree. As they made their way across the clearing, they got closer towards the other side. They could see that these lanterns, these lights, were turning and they were going deeper into the woods. At this point, they could tell that those lights were definitely lanterns, and Katie was starting to feel very uneasy. She brought it up to Sam. She told him that she did not think that they should go on any further, that she just had a very bad feeling, saying that we don't know who these people are. We don't know why they're out here. They could be dangerous. I think it's just best that we leave. Sam, David, and Sabrina tried to convince her that everything would be fine, that they were not in any danger, and that they should follow these lights, these lanterns, just a little bit further to see if they could figure out who these people were. Very reluctantly, Katie agreed to go along with them, so the four of them, again, they got up, made their way, again, from bush to bush, right to the edge of the clearing, and they could see up ahead of them in the direction where those lights had gone. They could see that these lights were now kind of forming almost like a semicircle around something about 150 yards into the woods. At this point, they very quietly, very stealthily made their way into the trees, kind of trying not to step on anything that could give them away. As they made their way closer towards where those lights were in that semicircle, they realized that they could hear something. They stopped just to listen to see what this was they were hearing, and they could tell that what they were hearing sounded like chanting coming from the direction of those lanterns. All four of them at this point, they all started to feel uneasy, but the boys said, you know what, we've come this far, let's get a little bit closer, let's see what these people are up to. If they spot us, we'll just take off and run. We'll try not to get caught, we'll just be very quiet, we should be okay. So very reluctantly, the girls ended up following Sam and David as they very cautiously made their way closer towards those lights and that chanting. Once they were about 50 yards away from that semicircle and those people chanting, they could see that right in front of those people, there appeared to be this almost makeshift rock altar, and it was completely surrounded all along the top and all along the ground by very large candles. And these people, there was about 15 of them, they were standing in a semicircle in front of it. They were all holding a lantern, and they were all wearing black robes with a black hood. And they were chanting, and they could not understand any of the words that they were saying. When all of a sudden, from in that group of those 15 people, one of them stepped forward, made his way up towards that altar, and placed something down on top of it. As soon as he did that, the rest of these people, their chanting became even louder. At this point, the four of them were completely terrified. They had no idea who these people are. They just see this altar, they see these people wearing these black robes, carrying lanterns out in the middle of nowhere that are chanting, and now one of them has placed something on this altar, and they're all getting even louder. At this point, the four of them figured this was their time to leave. So the four of them, they quickly turned around just to get out of there, and as soon as they turned and their attention was no longer on those people, that chanting completely stopped. As soon as they realized that that chanting had stopped, they quickly turned their attention back towards those people, and they noticed now that those people were no longer facing that altar. They had turned around and they were facing in their direction. The four of them just completely froze. They were figuring, did they see us? There's no way they should have been able to see us. We're wearing dark clothing. It's pitch black outside. We're in the woods. There's no way they could have seen us. We didn't make any noise. There's no way they could have heard us. So they just stood there basically completely frozen in fear, staring back at these people. They stood there for a few seconds when all of a sudden those people started making their way towards them where they were in the woods, and they were all holding their lanterns up so that they can see in front of them. At this point, they pretty much had no option. They could not just stand there, because if they stood there, very shortly these people would be able to see them. So they ended up having to just basically take their chance and just run and just forget about being quiet and just focus on trying to get out of there. So all four of them, they took a deep breath, and then they just started sprinting back towards that clearing. As they were running, they could hear those people behind them running after them as well, and they were yelling things at them. But because they were running through the trees and there was so much noise of the trees being broken, stuff that they were stepping on, plus the sound of their own breathing and their own heart rate, they could not make out what they were saying. As they made their way across a clearing, periodically they would turn around to look to see if these people were gaining on them. Luckily, they were not gaining on them, but they definitely were not putting any more ground in between them. And that really amped up their adrenaline and just really made them run that much faster. Once they got to the other side of the clearing, they started making their way up that other side of the valley, up towards that plateau. Once they got to that plateau, they looked down and they noticed that those lights were now in a completely straight line and they were not moving. The four of them, they took that opportunity to kind of try to catch their breath when all of a sudden they heard yelling coming from those people down in the valley. And they heard somebody yell up to them, "You saw nothing. If you say anything, we will find you." At this point, all four of them know now that yes, they are in danger, that these people are definitely doing something that they don't want anybody else to know about. So again, they ended up turning and they just made their way running all the way back towards their bikes. As they got closer to where their bikes were, they started to slow down their run a bit, start to kind of breathe a little bit easier because they realized that these people were not pursuing them down this trail. When they got to their bikes, they started pulling their bikes up when all of a sudden David noticed that right on his handlebars of his bike, there was a note taped to it. He quickly looked at this note. He could not make out what it said. It was way too dark. He kind of took it, shoved it in his pocket. They hopped on their bikes and they made their way back to David's house. Once they got home, back at David's place, David pulled that note out of his pocket, and on that note, it said, "You saw nothing. If you say anything, we will find you." At this point, the four of them were even more freaked out because this meant that at least one of those people made their way to their bikes without them even knowing. And what even confused them more and made them feel even more on edge was the fact that how did they know where their bikes were? Unless at least one of those people got to the trail sometime relatively close to when they got there and followed them into the woods. At this point, the four of them decided that they were not going to say anything at all to their parents about this, or pretty much anybody, because they did not know how much these people knew about them, because they had been out there every night for a week. Sam and David had been out there earlier in the day, so they did not know if these people really did know who they were, and they had no idea who these people were because they never saw their face. So they decided from that point on that they were just not going to say anything about it, and they were definitely not going back into those woods anytime soon. For the rest of summer, they avoided the woods, and pretty much to this day, the four of them will not go into the woods around that town ever again. Well, that's it for today's encounter. Because this happened in 1999, they're very convinced that the people that they ran into in the woods that night were part of some type of doomsday cult. But please let me know in the comments who you think these people could have been. As well, if you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.